We're live. Hello and a very warm welcome to all our viewers and those who are with us from Kashmir. We know and we realize that it's already past midnight, and it reflects nothing but your love and support for us. Believe us, it's only your love, support, and cooperation that we are encouraged to bring you these programs. So, a heartfelt thank you, Assalamu alaikum, and lots of prayers to you all from our entire Pent Online family. Dear viewers, as you might already be aware that today in this special session of ours, we endeavor to critically engage and explore certain aspects of our past and history, especially those that aren't much talked about. Here, in particular, we'll be talking about the event of 27th of October, 1947. In my limited understanding, I believe it is events and episodes like these that are used as foundational units and elements in the histories augmenting the nation building projects, especially of the post-colonial states. And these events and episodes, they significantly change and in certain cases radically alter the social and political landscape of societies and countries for ages to come. 27th of October, 1947 in Kashmir, without a doubt, and most certainly is one such event. It happened, and it happened in such a way that it influences, informs, and marks our lives, our society, our politics, our ideology, and whatnot, even today. But the moot point is, do we know all about it? Well, for the reply, I'll have to borrow from Lord Birdwood, who argues this phase to be punctuated with enigmas and silences. And in today's program, this live session, we endeavor, rather we aspire to uncover and unpack some of those aspects, some of those enigmas, and some of those silences. Sharing with me the responsibility of today's program is our team member, my co-host, Ifat. Ifat, a very warm welcome to you. And I'm particularly keen to know from you, because you yourself are a student and scholar of history. What's your take on today's program?
Hello, Tausif, and everybody else who has joined us now and who may watch us later. As you said, as a student of history myself, I do have keen interest in today's panel and in our conversation today. To further augment and to contextualize what you already said, why are we talking about a bygone era at this moment? Is then to understand E.H. Carr's seminal work of 1961 called What is History?, in which he argues that history in itself is this continuous dialogue between our past and present. Some of you may be aware of since 1947, Kashmir has been the site of territorial contestations between India and Pakistan. And history writing in itself becomes this important site which marks this territorial contestations over Kashmir. So for me then, as a student of history, it becomes an exemplary site to understand past, not just for the sake of past, but also to see how it continues to become a battleground for redefining or defining of these identities, especially national identities. To talk about various aspects and meanings and metaphors associated with 27th October 1947, we have with us three important guests who need no introduction. However, for ceremonial purposes, I call upon my co-host Tausif to kindly introduce our panelists for tonight. Thank you.
Thank you for the very wonderful words. Indeed, I'm much excited and equally glad to introduce our panelists for today. Joining us from London is the very popular Kashmiri author, writer, and journalist Mirza Waheed. Apart from many award-winning works, Mirza is the author of a very popular book in Kashmir, The Collaborator. Also with us is Professor Huma Dar from San Francisco, USA. Professor Huma Dar, she's a lecturer of gender and women's studies and ethnic studies at the University of California, Berkeley, and she's also an adjunct professor of critical thought and philosophy at the University of California. We're also glad to have amongst us from Melbourne, Professor Christopher Snedden. Professor Christopher Snedden is an Australian academic, political strategic analyst, and a security practitioner. He specializes in South Asia and has a keen interest in Kashmir conflict. Professor Sneddon is also the author of another very popular book in Kashmir, Kashmir, The Unwritten History. So, dear panelists, I, on behalf of PEN Online, thank you and welcome you to our live session. Now, without any further ado, I hand it over to Ifat to formally commence our conversation with the panelists. Ifat, if you may, please.
Thank you, Tausif. Beginning with you, Christopher, you may have come across some of these news items in recent weeks about Kashmir, where they are calling to observe 22nd October 1947 as Black Day rather than seeing 27th October as a Black Day. So there are these rhetorical declamations and repetitive chronicles being peddled about 27 October 1947 in Kashmir and beyond. In a Carlo Ginzburg's way of a historian as a judge, could you please tell us what is your rendering of 27th October as a historical event in Kashmir, and how does it shape Kashmir's modern history?
Well, it was highly significant, the 27th, because various things happened on that day. The first and most obvious is the arrival of Indian troops in Srinagar, and they have been there ever since, and that's part of the dynamic and part of the issue, probably one of the major issues. But it also actually ended the speculation of whether the Maharaja Hari Singh, was actually going to join his princely state, and I put his in inverted commas. He was the man who had to take the decision. The people weren't consulted and didn't need to be consulted, but it ended the speculation of whether Jammu and Kashmir was going to join India or Pakistan. It also ended 72 days of ostensible independence, and it also essentially formulated or began the division of the political entity of Jammu and Kashmir into Pakistan-administered areas and Indian-controlled areas. China later got involved as well. Another aspect was that it transferred power, or it started the transfer of power from the Dogras to Kashmiris, particularly the National Conference, and in particular Sheikh Abdullah. So for all of those reasons, it was quite significant. The other aspect that was significant was that Lord Mountbatten, who was then the Governor-General, he'd moved from being the Viceroy to become the Governor-General of India, he accepted Maharaja Hari Singh's accession and also said that when things stabilise and normalise, there will be a reference made to the people to determine whether they would support the accession to India. That later became called the plebiscite. Interestingly, though, on that day also, the Indian Defence Committee met and said, yes, we will accept the Maharaja's accession, and we think there should be a plebiscite with 3 options. So join Pakistan, stay with India, or for Jammu and Kashmir to become independent. Now, that independence quickly dropped by the wayside, but all of those things happened on the 27th. Also on that day, because Maharaja Hari Singh had made the accession, he also started to become, fairly quickly, superfluous. 2 days later, the emergency administration was formed, in which Sheikh Abdullah and National Conference members, none of whom had actually been elected, but who nevertheless were popular with the people, took over power, and Maharaja Hari Singh still had his Prime Minister Mahajan in place, but started to lose power very quickly, and the dynamic of power shifted very quickly from Jammu to Kashmir. All of those things happened around or on the 27th of October.
All right, thank you so very much, Professor Sneddon. You brought in these various aspects ascribed to the 27th of October, 1947, and indeed it's very enriching. Here, I want to stay with this event and investigate further into the complexities of the issue. But the angle that I want to take is a little different. I want to approach this thing from a bottom-up perspective and take a more of a micro-analytical approach into this. So for that, I'll turn to Huma. Huma, your family has had a direct bearing of this event. They were unfortunately forced into exile. So from the kind of traditions and memories that you must have bequeathed as a first generation post that event, what kind of light could you shine on the complex political terrain of Kashmir of that time? And as Christopher said, that National Conference was quite popular that time. Would it somehow puncture this widely fed narrative that National Conference was the only or monopolizing political force or mainstream in Kashmir?
Thank you for that, Tausif, and thank you for that laying down of the historical foundations of the day, Christopher. When I was hearing you, I was just remembering what my dad used to tell me, that in the interim period between 15th August and 27th October, there was a flag of Pakistan that used to fly on the GPO, the General Post Office, the main post office of Srinagar. And there were lots of people who loved Sheikh Abdullah, but there were also maybe even more people who loved the idea of Pakistan, who loved Jinnah, and who did not want to be a part of India. And I think those histories have, our fabulous upcoming historian Ifat and our historian Christopher Snedden have done a lot of work on it. There's Ilyas Chatta as well, who has done a lot of work on it. But there's still many more histories, because when my aunt was arrested by Sheikh Abdullah's, the police under him in 1948, when she went to see Corbell, Mr. Corbell, who was the chief of the UN committee that had come to Kashmir, come to Srinagar to investigate how the people were doing and what was their will, what was the state of affairs in Kashmir at large. She was not allowed to go and see him because she was known to be with MC. Her husband had already been arrested. He was a member of the Legislative Assembly that was belatedly formed by the Maharaja. Her husband was this barrister, Ghani, and she herself was the inspectress of schools, the first woman ever to be an inspectress of school in Jammu and Kashmir. In fact, she was the first woman to have a BA and BT, the Bachelor's in Teaching, in 1934 from the entire state. So she had to go in a burqa to be incognito because she was not being allowed a meeting with Mr. Corbell. She and her friend Agha Shahid Ali, the poet laureate of, in English of Kashmir, we all love to love him. His aunt, his eldest uncle's wife, and my aunt were best friends. They both went together. They both donned burqas. They borrowed burqas from their mothers, and they went to see Corbell. And they immediately, when they saw Corbell in SP College, they raised their niqabs and they said, please do not listen to whatever Sheikh Abdullah is telling you. You need to go into the alleys and each neighborhood of Kashmir yourself. He is not telling you the truth. People want freedom. People do not want to be with India. There are thousands and thousands of people arrested. Now, these words of her that there are thousands of people arrested are in UN documentations, but I have yet to find more historical documentation of that. And I'm really counting on you, Ifat, because I can't go to Kashmir. India would never give me the visa to visit Kashmir at this point. I'm counting on you guys to find those records and put that into a commonly available, publicly available forum for all of us to reconsider our histories. There were many people who protested. There were many people who protested the arrival of the Indian army. And I think the whole tribal invasion, the myth of the tribal invasion has been very fabulously busted by Professor Snedden, even when he talks about the composition of the so-called tribal army. So given our own position, I think it really gives a very interesting twist to the history of Kashmir that people living in Indian occupied Kashmir have been told over and over again through media, through education. People in Pakistan have been told, or people in India. So a historiography has this major lacuna, and the genocide of people in Jammu and Kashmir, and I'm very advisedly including both Jammu and Kashmir, although the vast majority of people who were victims of the genocide and ethnic cleansing were in Jammu, but there were many who were also ethnically cleansed and forcibly exiled from Kashmir as well, including my family and the family of, part of the family of the Mirwais, part of the family of Agha Shahid Ali. There were many people who were, who wanted plebiscite, who were ethnically cleansed. So it gives the whole myth of the genocide being that of Pandits. It puts really that into a perspective, right? And this was a genocide that would be conceded to be a genocide by any definition of the word, right? It's not just an incremental genocide. It's when anywhere from the minimum number of people who were killed is 237,000, right? And people have projected up to 500,000 people were killed. And those of us who were exiled go anywhere from 500,000 to 1.1 million. So even if you go by the lower limit, that's 737,000 people who were ethnically cleansed. That's about 20% of the entire projected population of Jammu and Kashmir at that point, which was 4 million, right? So this is quantitatively and qualitatively different from the riots and the massacres that happened at Pakistan. And that point, we cannot rub it under the same rug as partition riots. It cannot be subsumed by the narrative of partition. This is particular, this is engineered. This is engineered by the Maharaja. This is engineered by Patel, the Home Minister of the newly independent India, and by RSS, militants. So this is not the same as the partition violence. It has to be considered on its own 2 feet.
Thank you, Huma, for sharing those insights. Indeed, we do have these craggy complexities lurking beneath Kashmir's political landscape, and it's these nuances which we must be be unpacking. Actually, the number of killings in Jammu, I would say, could be put to historical scrutiny, as Christopher also does in his work. But obviously, a silence in the archive does not mean an absence. Coming to you, Vahid. When I was researching on this war itself, in the India-Pakistan War of 1947-48, I unpacked these very interesting facts about how these progressive writers, those writers who associated themselves with this progressive writers movement, whether be it Ahmad Faraz or, for example, Faiz Ahmad Faiz, and the political scientist called Iqbal Ahmed on the Azad Kashmir side. And we have Rajendra Singh Bedi, who is documenting this epic story on the importance of salt in Kashmir's life. Unlike the South Asian partition stories, where we have these important writers like Saadat Hasan Manto, do you believe that there is dearth of literary sources on this period and the period after in the case of Kashmir?
Thank you for very enlightening comments earlier. Absolutely, there's a dearth. But before we talk about writers and what they do with how they engage with historical events and politics, with your permission, of course, I want to talk about today, because which will not detract from the topic on the discussion. Because you see, without, as Huma earlier said, and Christopher said, and as you said, and Tawfiq said, without an honest, truthful remembrance and of history, there cannot be an honest reckoning with the present, because then the bedrock is, the foundation is shaky. And with that, so 27th October is, and we have to, you said something earlier about why do we engage with events of a bygone era. It is not bygone at all for me or for anyone in Kashmir. It's a continuously lived history. 27th October 47 is alive to this day. And that does not have to depend on whether there has been enough academic or literary or creative work on it. It's a lived experience, lived reality. What do I mean by that? When the soldiers arrive in 47, Kashmiris didn't want those soldiers. We all know who asked them to come in and why they came in. They came in a trickle. And all these years later, what does it mean? What does that day mean? The day means that the soldiers are now everywhere in Kashmir. They are on the streets, they are at the crossroads, they are in encampments, they are in our orchards, they are in our paddies, they are on our highways, in our lakes, on our rivers, everywhere, since that awful day. And today, essentially what it means is that that army, that occupational army, has grown into a massive hydra, and is forever growing, as we saw today. Well, that's why I wanted to bring it today. So today, these, when they call these, they enact a law, or there is a notification that from today anyone from India can buy land in Kashmir, and they don't need any prior permission or any special documents, so to speak. What does it mean? It is militarism, occupation by other means. There is no difference for me between what the military in Kashmir does and what the political dispensation does. It's one and the same thing. Huma mentioned the role of the RSS earlier in the violence, in the pogrom, anti-Muslim pogrom against Muslims in the Jammu region. And that's a very interesting moment in history, because what we see today now is an RSS occupation of Kashmir again, from that brutal moment of violence to this kind of violence, where now the agenda, the RSS's agenda of a Hindu majoritarian state, is sweeping across India, but crucially across Kashmir, because Kashmiris are Muslim, and you cannot dissociate the Muslim character of Kashmir, from what is being done, what was done in 1947, what was done subsequently through our own client elites who, sadly, tragically, or rather disgracefully, have helped India's cause in Kashmir by enabling this militarism and occupation. And to this day, we are living the horrible fruits of that day. And I wanted to mention this because every time there is a new measure, almost every day, the Indian state announces something to reprogram Kashmiri lives, our cultural life, our economic life, our political life, of course, to begin with. All aspects are being reprogrammed at breakneck speed. And the political classes on the ground in Kashmir, what have they done? What are they doing? Absolutely nothing. A photo op in response to a brutal, military act means nothing. So we're at that crossroads where the events of 27th October 47 are being unfolded every single day as we speak. Now, with regard to why was there, if the writers responded properly, adequately, no. I mean, it's not. There's no particular number that did. Also, you have to understand Kashmir's peculiar tragic history. We were a very, very oppressed lot, and economically completely destitute in many ways. Yeah. So, and when post 47, a lot of the writing classes or the literary classes, they depended on state patronage. And when I say this, I don't mean a broad sweep across everyone, but a large number of our poets and writers, they depended on state patronage. And when you depend on state patronage, then you will, there is a kind of censorship that is inbuilt in the project. But that said, there have been many voices in Kashmiri, in Urdu, because often the mistake we make, including myself, is sometimes when we look at the literary output or from Kashmir, you see it from the prism of English writing in English. And what we sometimes forget, that Kashmiris have been writing for centuries, in Persian before, centuries ago. And Urdu, of course, and Kashmiri, of course. What does need to happen, perhaps will happen, and people are working on this, is a reckoning, is an examination of those texts. Because unless there's scholarship about Kashmiri writers, about Urdu writers, Kashmir has a very rich poetic tradition. A lot of Kashmir's literary voices happened in that realm. So unless there is an examination, and there will be an examination, there are very brilliant young scholars at work who are kind of looking at Kashmir's literary past, and there should be, But yes, to answer your question directly, did we have a Manto rising up and stating the blunt, hard truths against India's occupation in 1947? Perhaps not in that way, but that doesn't mean nobody spoke.
Well, absolutely.
Can I put in a word to augment Mirza Waheed's fabulous contribution right now? I wanted to say that Faiz Ahmad Faiz's last visit to Jammu and Kashmir was precisely to convince Sheikh Abdullah to join Pakistan. And this is something that all of India, all of Pakistan is amnesiac about, because they want to appropriate Hum Dekhenge. They want to appropriate Bol ke lab azad hain tere. They want to appropriate all of Faiz, but his actual, in the entirety of his politics. The entirety of his politics meant that he was the editor of Pakistan Times, founded by Jinnah. The entirety of his politics meant that he gave the last khutbah at his mosque in his home village near Sialkot. And these are things that are kind of censored out of the general public. And also about Manto. I think Manto's letters to Uncle Sam, Manto's letter to Pandit Nehru, which was written as a preface to his Ganje Farishte, because he was suffering intensely because of the piracy of his books, his words in India while he was going penniless. He's a second cousin of my mother. He was penniless, so broke that desperation intensified his alcoholism, led to his death. So I hold Indian piracy accountable to his death. It was this capitalist piracy of a writer that led to his misfortune. And in that letter to Nehru, and he precisely calls him Pandit Nehru. And he says, I know that you will read this letter because it's going to be published. Whether I like it or not, you're going to pirate it and you're going to read it. And I want to make sure that you read it. And he talks about Kashmir. He talks about his last name, Manto, that, so these Kichlus and Mantos, my mother's family, were forcibly exiled from the valley in the middle of the 19th century during the Dogra rule. At the end of the Sikh rule and the beginning of Dogra rule, precisely because their act of conversion into Islam. And as you guys know, I'm speaking in front of historians and scholars here. During the Dogra rule, anyone who converted to Islam in the Sikh and the Dogra regimes, their properties were confiscated, right? And even in 1931, the day we celebrate as Martyrs' Days, one of the spurs was in Jammu, where a family had converted to Islam. And the guy had sued the courts, and there were derogatory things said about Islam and Muslims in the court. So there was a protest in Jammu streets. So in any case, Manto, and he writes to Pandit Nehru as a Pakistani. He writes that I'm writing as a Pakistani today and a Kashmiri today, and you and I are both Kashmiris. Come to my home, I'll give you Shabdeg. Shabdeg is something that I guess Ifat and Waheed Bhai, you guys have probably no longer eat Shabdeg, but this is an old Kashmiri dish of turnips and beef that we still make in the rest of the diaspora, right? It's a segment of an old menu that was no longer possible in occupied Jammu and Kashmir because the Dogras and the Sikhs made the eating of beef a crime and liable to capital punishment.
It was punished. There are records. I mean, and I read these accounts. Sorry, Huma, to interrupt. That was fantastic. With regard to beef eating, why I said there is a religious element to this, which has become obviously more and more heightened now. In Srinagar, there's a bridge called Fateh Kadal, one of the oldest bridges on the river Jhelum. They used to hang Kashmiri Muslims by a pole, by a pylon, for passers-by to see the body of the man who had been punished. A chilling message to people who might consider eating beef, because they had to pass through this body hung black and dry and parched by a poll. This is not an invention or a matter of creative writing, or so to speak. This happened. So, you know, we are at a crossroads, and that moment of history, 1947, is kind of, you know, is cast a dark and continuous shadow, and it's terrifying.
Absolutely, I quite agree with this. The kind of narratives, these stories that are coming to us makes us further believe that the kind of the history or the text that we've been fed with over the time has been overwhelmingly sanitized, which I in the beginning also said that it was to augment this nation building project. So your memories, your ideas, and your past is being redefined. What's happening this time? Particularly when Mirza talked about the things that have happened. And I myself got very interested because like maybe because of my training, I try to see things on a continuum. So plotting this thing, not as something discrete, but on a continuum. So what happened on 27th of October, 1947, and what happens today on the 27th of October, 2020 is nothing but a manifestation of what happened in 1947. So we are actually plotting it on a continuum. So it doesn't end anywhere, it's still continuing, and there's no end to it in near future. We can only pray for the best. And then what was very interesting was to understand in this the role of these political clients, who in a way have lubricated and further facilitated this process, but then they're always masqueraded as the saviors of the people. So these are the kind of treacheries and hypocrisies that people have been like continuously engineered with, fed with, and their minds have been manipulated in ways more than one. And maybe because we've been in very uncertain and very, very suppressive times, we haven't had a time to critically think about these things. Now, thankfully, like our own scholarship is coming up. Here, I want to go to Professor Snedden. I'm not a student of history, but then it's widely acknowledged that the best way of understanding history or our past is to understand history as contingent rather than looking at it from the lens of presentism, in a way that you try to understand those historical events from that very context. I'm quite interested because as Wahid and Huma, they actually portrayed a canvas where 1947 appears as very complex. So could you please run us through, as far as your readings are concerned, 1947, where this widely fed popular narrative that 27th of October is celebrated more of like a liberatory day where a dawn of freedom has come, and the constituency of National Conference and their followers are celebrating. Then over the time, there is an overwhelming switch, rather a snowballing of this event as a Black Day. What do you think in your readings? How does this explain the variations of these experiences, imaginations, and metaphors?
Thank you, Tusif. And I wanted to thank you and IFAT for organising this. It's a great honour to be involved. And one of the challenges that I confront in terms of history and in terms of your history is that I don't speak Kashmiri or Dogri or Urdu sufficiently well enough to be able to access primary source documents. So I'm relying on English primary source documents. Now, two of my responses to what Mirza and Huma have very insightfully said, and thank you both very much, is that the first is that India was much better organized than Pakistan in terms of its strategy to, and I put this in inverted commas, capture Jammu and Kashmir for India. And that was because the Congress was more popular, more widespread, and so on and so forth, had more resources. Certainly in August 1946, the Jammu and Kashmir went on the agenda for Congress, and they started to think about it thereafter. But the second thing is also that there was this incredible link between Nehru and Abdullah. And we do have to be careful of presentism and revisionism, because whether we like it or not, Sheikh Abdullah was incredibly popular
that he was,
and certainly very influential in 1947. it's incredibly difficult, in fact, almost impossible to determine how popular he was. But he was very influential. And with the Pakhtuns arriving on the 22nd, the Pakhtuns had bad, or Kashmiris had bad memories of Pakhtuns. If you remember, the Duranis controlled, before the Sikhs arrived, the Duranis controlled Kashmir. And they were as brutal as anybody. And then the Sikhs, they were hoping that there might be some relief under the Sikhs, but the Sikhs also were very exploitative. And then the Dogras came. And they were, according for Kashmiris anyway, Muslim Kashmiris, very little improvement either. So with these Pakhtuns arriving, people were fearful for their personal safety. So they needed somebody who was going to help them protect their lives and their property. And at that stage, Sheikh Abdullah was, for a whole variety of reasons, the man for the job. And it's partly to do with the politics. The National Conference was far more popular in the Kashmir Valley than Jammu. The Muslim Conference was the reverse. It was far more popular in Jammu than it was in Kashmir. But Huma, you talked about people being expelled. The National Conference expelled a lot of their rivals. And I met a wonderful journalist in Rawalpindi called Mir Abdul Aziz, who'd been the secretary of the Muslim Conference, and he was told to leave basically the valley or be incarcerated. So it's really difficult to understand what was going on at that particular point of time. And for all of you younger Kashmiris who speak all of these languages, you may not speak Dogri, but you need to get into the Jammu and Kashmir archives and access some of those documents. Same with the Indian archives. There's some on the Pakistan side as well. And try and go back to the primary sources. The primary sources that I've accessed have been, I've trawled my way through the Times of India, the Times itself, and various other things, but there's a lot of other local sources there that will describe what's happening. But it's really difficult to get to know fairly certainly what happened in 1947. But I do think when the Indians arrived, they did it with a degree of support from a lot of Kashmiris. Remembering, of course, that Sheikh Abdullah also had organised, and the National Conference, a Kashmiri militia, because they were concerned about the arrivals of the Pakhtuns, and they said, we're going to fight to defend ourselves. So there's a whole heap of other things that need to be teased out. Certainly this massacre in Jammu, very difficult, almost impossible to determine how organised it was. There is some evidence to suggest that the Maharaja and some of his ilk were involved, and the RSS leader Golwalkar had spoken to the Maharaja early in October, which is around the same time that there was some incredible violence. And I reread my chapter last night on this massacre and it wasn't just Muslims. Muslims suffered more than everybody else, but Sikhs and Hindus also suffered. In Azad Kashmir, the census of 1951 said there were only about 1,000 left, when beforehand 10% of the Poonch Jagir had comprised non-Muslims, Hindus and Sikhs. So both communities suffered, but Muslims clearly more so than others. But it's really difficult to find hard evidence. And the Times did talk about 237,000 Muslims killed or forced to flee. It didn't actually discriminate and say how many were killed and how many were forced to flee. The Englishmen who investigated this for the Civil and Military Gazette, their figures suggest that there were about 70,000, but they're guesstimates, not exact figures. The Indian census of 1961 said that there was a phenomenal fall in the rural population in the Indian areas of Jammu that they controlled by about 1/3. So clearly Muslims disappeared. Many were killed, particularly women, unfortunately, killed or kidnapped, more so than men, but a lot also fled to Pakistan. That is an issue that is very difficult to quantify. And therein lies the challenge for younger Kashmiris, I would suggest.
So if I can...
small point, it's absolutely right. Sheikh Abdullah was very popular. It is a matter of historical record and people's memory. And it wasn't too far back in the past that it can be contested in significant ways. He was popular. He was a mass leader. Kashmiris know that, and they supported him. And that is precisely why the betrayal the Sheikh's betrayal of the Kashmiri people assumes a much more significant and terrifying and dangerous, position in the history of Kashmir, because Kashmiris trusted him. Everyone knows. Kashmiris used to say, "We will go with whatever the Sheikh decides." There was so much trust amongst a large population of Kashmiri Muslims. Sheikh was the tallest leader, as they said. And that is why Sheikh's betrayal, yes, of course, wasn't held by his great friend Nehru, who betrayed Sheikh as well. After putting him in, and by the time he came out of prison, this is what they wanted to do to him. They wanted to break him, and he broke, and he agreed to everything. By the time he came out, of course, then Nehru wasn't there. It was Indira Gandhi who then signed this accord with Sheikh by which time he had agreed to everything. So the Sheikh's betrayal, is also something that needs to be reckoned with in much more detail. Which brings me to this current point. His successors in the political classes, 2 or 3 parties, the National Conference, the PDPs of the world, and so it's now their moment of reckoning, now or never. Actually, what do they do with this moment? When forever, for decades, they have championed India's cause. They have been India's people in Kashmir. They have been Delhi-appointed people in Kashmir. They have ruled Kashmir on behalf of Delhi. They have been the face of the military occupation of Kashmir. All those things are true. The question now is, what do they do now that they have been reduced to what they are, which is they make a press conference once in a while. There's a friend of mine who once said that if they forever, the national conferences and then the PDPs of the world, they have always said that they are the true representatives of the Kashmiri people, because they contest elections and people vote for them for jobs and for electricity, for a bit of to fix a road or something. They've always said that they are the true representatives of Kashmir. And then this friend of mine said, when was the last time these people who live rather very close to the UN body in Kashmir, to the UN offices in Kashmir, when was the last time they visited the UN? They went to the UN with the Kashmiri case, or the case of the people they claim to represent.
So
that was a distraction.
No. If I could jump in for a little bit, and I think we've all done a very good job of explaining this paradox of Kashmir at the time of 1947, when there's great love for Sheikh Abdullah on one point, but also a great hatred for accession to India. And I think India realized it, Nehru realized it very soon afterwards, because that is why they never held the plebiscites. There is correspondence between Indira Gandhi and Pandit Nehru, that it doesn't seem like people will vote for India. They realized very soon, as much as the Kashmiris loved Nehru, loved Sheikh Abdullah, they are not going to accede. They do not willingly accede to India. And that was, and this is also the reason why Sheikh Abdullah went full force and did the most amazing thing he ever did, which was the land redistribution program, to win the people even more, that maybe this way they will really side with me and do whatever I'm telling them to do, right? So, here's an amazing part of our history, which also gets neglected. The most radical land redistribution project in all of South Asia. And we also have this paradox that the people loved Abdullah, but they would not have voted for accession with India.
Look, there's another issue too, and it's to do with perception. When Jammu and Kashmir joined India, when the Maharaja acceded to India, it was absolute as far as Nehru was concerned. He thought that Jammu and Kashmir would join India and ultimately would be integrated into India. That was Nehru's not only perception, but that was his aim as well, that Kashmiris would join India and just become normal, average Indians. Sheikh Abdullah and others, including the Maharaja, felt that they had a special consideration, that they had only acceded for foreign affairs, communications and defence, as all other Maharajas did, or Rajas or Nawabs or whatever they were. There were about 140 who made an accession, who were entitled to make an accession. But therein lies part of the challenge, that the Kashmiris felt that they'd only acceded for those particular aspects and that they needed and were special. But Nehru said, okay, you're going to be special for a period of time, but ultimately we want to integrate you. And Article 370 was a temporary provision. And that's the challenge. The BJP says, you're ordinary Indians, get on with it and become ordinary Indians. And by the way, we're going to make you ordinary Indians. The people in Kashmir, particularly those in the valley. Now, Kashmir is a difficult term. We have to understand that Kashmir has two different meanings. Within India, it means the Kashmir Valley. Within Pakistan, it means all of the former princely state. But when I'm using the word Kashmir, I'm talking about you and your folk from the valley. So for Kashmir, they thought they were special and they want to continue to be special. And that's part of the dynamic of this dispute. There's really three disputes. There's the territorial dispute between India and Pakistan. There's the dispute between Kashmir, the regime, of the former India, Jammu and Kashmir, which Kashmiris have always dominated since 1947, despite what Ladakhis and Jammuites may want. And the third aspect of the Kashmir dispute is what Kashmiris themselves want. Do they want an independence? Do they want to be with India? Do they want to be with Pakistan? Do they want to be something else or somewhere else? And there's a whole heap of disputes there as well. But the perceptions are also important.
But there's one thing that's been very clear, that they, there might sections, but they've never wanted to be with India.
Exactly.
A large, overwhelming majority of Kashmiri Muslims have never wanted with India, never wanted to be with India. Why do I say that? When 47 happens and Sheikh is given, this emergency leader position of, so on and so forth, then soon we have the UN, becoming part of the conflict, with the dispute. When the term plebiscite comes into currency and it enters popular consciousness, you have to understand, why do Kashmiris then wait? They are okay with this temporary position of a special status because everyone knows we are going to be given a chance to decide our future. Why do they suit that? Because both these states make the promise. Nehru makes the promise again and again and again. Of course, he never wanted Kashmir to leave India. He wanted to possess Kashmir. He had this sort of obsession with Kashmir and he wanted to possess it, and so on and so forth. But when he makes these promises, Sheikh Abdullah is able to tell, and how it filters down to the population is, okay, we are going to get a chance. For now, we're protected. Nobody's marching in, taking away our lands. The question of land becomes very, very important with regard to Kashmir because of our history of dispossession. And then, as Huma mentioned earlier, yes, Sheikh becomes popular. He does the great reforms do bring some sort of a degree of prosperity to the Kashmiri Tilla. So the land is a very, very essential part of Kashmiri identity because they didn't have any. Land, houses, orchards, fruit. This becomes a very, very huge part of Kashmiri identity. That is why these decisions since last year, when they abrogate this and that, and they erase autonomy, which is already token autonomy, and as Christopher mentioned earlier, it was there in letter, and they've been eroding it, even starting with Nehru, it began to be eroded, but it was still there. There was this symbolic protection that the Kashmiris thought is going to protect us because we are not, mainstream India. We are not part of India. Now, these assaults, today's body blow, is exactly meant to do that, to destroy Kashmiri identity to the point that the very thing we have been struggling for, the very thing we have been fighting for, the aim of the RSS and the new Indian state is to destroy that so badly, so completely, that there is nothing left to fight for. And this is a reality Kashmiris have to reckon with, including the so-called mainstream political classes. This is what the new India is telling Kashmiris. We will take away everything, including the very thing you have been struggling for, which is your identity, your being. Where does it derive from? It derives from our innate bond with our nature, with our land, with our rivers, with our homes, with our orchards, with our fruits, with our apples. and all those things. And of course, our huge cultural identity.
And,
So
and
they
I would
want,
like-
sorry, carry on.
I can just put in a little bit. I would like to dissent with Professor Snedden about your comment that India envisioned Kashmiris to be subsumed within India as regular Indians. I don't think we were ever, at least the Kashmiri Muslims, which is the majority of Jammu and Kashmir, was never, ever envisioned to be subsumed within India as a regular Indian. We were.
Huma, I think Professor Snowden meant it was the India's plan.
India's plan, but I don't think it was the plan because, and you know, the Tawsif mentioned the sanitization of history. I would call it Brahminization of history. Congress was 96.4% upper caste Hindus. That was one of the reasons why Jinnah claimed that you do not represent Dalits, you do not represent all of India. That's why Dr. Ambedkar said, you do not represent us.
You know, I think what
was not representative of 75% of India pre-partition.
No, I agree. I think what was meant was that the design of the Indian state was to completely bring Kashmiris into.
I agree. But my little
there's another very important point, Huma.
Kashmiris never wanted that. They still don't want that.
They meant to reduce us to the pre-47, that literacy level of 2% and 3% that we had, landless, indigent, begar, indentured labor. That's what they always wanted to reduce us. Unless we become, you know, Jai Bharat Mata and Bharat Mata Ki Jai and Vande Mataram, unless we somehow woke up the next day and become this Vande Mataram reciting Indian citizens, which is impossible.
Absolutely. So there's another very important point, Professor Snedden, before you could intervene, because I have a point where you very interestingly talk about the temporariness of Article 370 or 35A of the Indian Constitution. So the temporariness, I'm reminded of this committee on the constitutionality of the Kashmir Constitution and how much of the autonomy was actually snatched, which was formed by Sheikh Abdullah after 1977, and D.D. Thakur and Ghulam Ahmad Shah were the part of it. I happened to read that report wherein these things come up. And when we talk about the temporariness of it, it's in consideration legally that Kashmir was not actually a part of India, and there was this plebiscite that was to happen. That's why it was temporary. It wasn't given any date. And because it was pending the ultimate referendum that would be taken by the people. Comparing it to other temporary provisions like Saurashtra and Vidarbha, other regions, there was a time frame mentioned, maybe 10 years, 20 years, 30 years down the line, these special provisions would be taken away. But for Kashmir, there was no time frame because it was temporary, pending a final resolution.
Yeah, but it wasn't, the legality is an interesting issue, because if you look at the Indian Independence Act and not just the provisions, but also some of the things that happened in response to that, some of the precedents, then India did actually obtain Jammu and Kashmir. The Maharaja was the only one entitled to make the accession. He didn't have to consider the will of the people. He didn't have to consider geography, although he was encouraged to consider both. He was the ultimate arbiter. He eventually chose India. Now, India, of its own volition, and I believe it made a huge mistake, offered the reference to the people. And it did so because it had done the same for Janagar, which was also contested, the total reverse situation of Jammu and Kashmir, a Muslim Nawab and a Hindu population. And Nehru being the idealist, and I totally agree with Mirza, he was obsessed with Kashmir because of his familial links. He wanted it to join India. He also didn't like Jinnah, and you cannot discount the personalities in this. Abdullah and Nehru both did not like Jinnah and found him incredibly difficult, which is one of the reasons, a very small reason, why Abdullah ultimately was pro-India. He didn't want to go to Jinnah, nor did Hari Singh ultimately. They found him really difficult. But all of those things, in terms of the legality, it is actually legal. And now for Pakistan to turn around and talk about it being illegally Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir, it's actually not correct. So you've got to be careful with the terminology and with the legality. And thankfully, I am not a lawyer. And I don't know that Mirza is. Huma, are you a lawyer?
I'm not a lawyer, but in another lifetime, when I used to do computer science, my project was on artificial intelligence and legal reasoning. And so there's a bit of that legal reasoning and logicality that I have pursued throughout my work. I would dare to disagree with you again, Professor Snedden, because I don't think the Maharaja had a right to sign that instrument of accession, because Poonch, for example, was already free. Gilgit and Baltistan was already free. He no longer had sovereignty over them. And the fact
that's another legal argument. Was he entitled to sign that because he was no longer in possession of his full?
And also the fact how he ended up with the sovereignty of Jammu and Kashmir via a legal sale at the hands of British in 1846, the Treaty of Amritsar.
Yeah, but that is not unusual.
On the history of UK, of United Kingdom, Great Britain has a big debt that it owes us. It absolutely does. It landed up in an abysmal, horrible, devastating state of affairs for the vast majority of people who resided in Jammu Kashmir without a will. They sold us. As Iqbal said, they sold us our lands, our goats, our homes, our sheep without our will, and how cheaply they sold us.
But that is not unusual. There are two other examples that are highly significant, one of which relates to South Asia. The Pakistanis bought the Gwadar area from the Sultan of Oman in 1956, I think. And if you look at the United States of America, the nation in which you're currently residing, they purchased Alaska from the Russians, lock, stock and barrel, polar bears and people and everything.
Professor Snedden, neither was the sale of Jammu and Kashmir legal, nor was the sale of Alaska legal. I am living in a settler colony. I have no doubt about the fact that I'm living in a settler colony where the indigenous people are being stripped of their rights every day. The kind of history they have faced is the kind of history we face. The betrayal of treaties, the false promises and the betrayal of treaty over and over and over again. Mirza Waheed, they used Abdullah, this promises, this wooing, seduction of the Kashmiris, and then poof, a law comes down and one treaty is out. Poof, another law.
I don't. Sorry to butt in.
From A to Z.
I'm sorry to
I don't
intervene.
attach a lot of sanctity to laws. Sorry, and I must speak as a slightly. I don't attach sanctity to laws. I'll tell you why. So laws are manifestations of power. You know, if today the Indian government, the Indian state has the Kashmir is seized, you know, it's besieged. There's lots and lots of soldiers, armed everywhere. They control everything. It is the most densely militarized place on the planet. Now, if you, in that theater, in that context, you say something is a law, it doesn't mean much because you are forcing those laws through the barrel of the gun.
Exactly.
When you have surrounded, incarcerated a population, you know, whose voice has been snatched, they can't forget assembly, they can't even speak. They're not allowed to speak. Speech is criminalized. Mm-hmm. Little boys have been put into prison, tortured. 13,000 was a conservative estimate, the number of people who were put into prison by the Indian state last year. 13,000. Torture, you know, sexual violence. I mean, it's the catalog is dirty and dirty and dirty. Why do I say this? Because when we then say, oh, this so-and-so act was passed, it doesn't have to have sanctity, you know, because it's like, for instance, when the Maharaja signs, okay, let's say he signs, he was a very, very unpopular king. He was a tyrant. He had reduced Kashmiri, ordinary Kashmiris to penury, you know, completely dispossessed. They have nothing. You know, when
Sorry to intervene.
Okay, carry on,
here.
please.
Sorry to intervene here before we go deeper into this.
All I meant was I don't respect these laws.
Absolutely.
These laws because they are not laws.
Yeah.
They are. These some of these laws are. Let me give you a quick example. Then sorry. You know, in the 1956 or 1955, the Indian state imposed a law called AFSPA, which was derived from a British era emergency law. It imposed it for the first time in the northeastern state of Manipur. Yeah. And it was announced on the floor of the Indian Parliament that this law will stay there for 6 months. In 1955 or 56, it stayed there until recently. They said it's there for 6 months. It stayed there for the next 60 years. So I don't have to respect any of these laws, or we don't have to attach so much historical weight. Laws are made by people in power, and then they can be erased by people in power.
Absolutely. I totally agree, Wahid. I mean, these are two different aspects, or say, for example, two different ways of looking at it, legality versus legitimacy, if I may borrow Carl Smith's ideas about legality versus legitimacy. I want to come back to 1947 and discussion on that. Homa, you have already pointed out these, sort of varied experiences and meanings and metaphors attached to it. But we often tend to see a particular event as a monolith, right? So if we scratch beneath the surface of this monolith, you work, you are a scholar, you take that approach of intersectionality. Do you think if we sort of scratch underneath this monolith, you would get varied experiences and imaginations across, say, for example, region, gender, or class, so as to say?
Much for that question. Excellent question, Ifat. I think absolutely there is so much heterogeneity. There is so much granularity of experiences that went into 1947 and the genocide that bookended it. And it didn't just end in 47. I would argue that it went all the way until late 49, early 1950. And that's how most of these the genocides of Nonj Dure, they don't just last a month, 2 months. The trickle down effect lasts for much longer. And so the people of Jammu, I think, get forgotten. The Muslims of Jammu get forgotten. That migrant population, that exiled, the ethnically cleansed population gets forgotten. And let's see on the other side, how does Palestine deal with it, right? They have a term, Nakba, where they commemorate a similar ethnic cleansing of their people under the Israeli occupation, and the Palestinians who were forcibly exiled, ethnically cleansed, and had to live in Egypt or Lebanon or Jordan or wherever else in the surrounding countries. They mark themselves as Palestinians to this date, and they're very active in the Palestinian freedom struggles. I think we have been, and because of our penury, because of the very abysmal socioeconomic state that we were in 1947, we could not do a better job of reminding all of ourselves, forget about the others, even ourselves, that we are a much larger people who has been deliberately scattered around, and to hold our voices as significant. And not everybody speaks Kashmiri, right? Even within those who were exiled from within the valley, my family was originally, many generations ago, they were from a little village near Budgaon called Wenger, and then settled in Srinagar for the longest time. So, but after, and my father was 24 when he was forcibly exiled. He married my mother, who was also Kashmiri, but from the Kichliu, the mid 19th century exile. So she did not speak Kashmiri. As a result of that, I don't speak Kashmiri. I heard my father speaking in kosher to his siblings and his, all the other relatives, but not to us because my mother didn't speak it. And I know that sometimes in Kashmiri gatherings, I'm the odd one out because I don't speak Kashmiri, and that can sometimes be used as a marker. How Kashmiri am I? Right? And this is, to me, this is actually an evidence of colonialism. This is an evidence of the colonial stripping of my tongue from my mouth. It is as painful as exactly what I've described, of a tongue that has been taken out from my mouth. This is my mother tongue. My mother tongue is Kashmiri that I don't speak. And if we look at the people in the Turtle Islands or the United States of America, which is a settler colony, I myself am residing here in Berkeley, which is an Ohlone, it belongs to the Ohlone people. It's an unceded territory of the Ohlone people. Their language, Ohlone language, many people did not speak it, and they are now teaching their children. There'll be one elder who speaks Ohlone, and they start teaching their other children, and the children are teaching other kids. So it's there's a lot more granularity to our experience than only to only kosher speaking, and to be able to comprehend our experiences through that lens of colonialism, through that lens of settler colonialism. And the experience of Poonchis, for example, is different, but the one thing that holds us together is the shared experience of draconian tyranny under the Dogras. So Poonchis suffered terribly under the Dogras, right? And so we have to talk to each other. Really, it will make us stronger. It will not make us weaker. It is going to make us stronger, because we have suffered immensely under the colonialism, starting from the Mughal colonialism in 1586. So I would argue the land, it wasn't that we never had land, Wahid. Land has been stolen from beneath our feet, bit by bit, by spurts.
I was talking in the context of pre-47.
So I mean, there was a reason why we were left landless. In the Dogra Raja, I think Mridu Rai does a very good work of recording how land was stolen from beneath our feet. The famines that the Muslim Kashmiris suffered.
It was all other. It wasn't just land. All the economic aspects. For instance, the Kashmiri artisan.
Exactly.
Kashmiri artisan.
The right to bear arms. Mughals were the one who first initiated that. Kashmiri Muslims do not have the right to bear arms. Kashmiri Brahmins, the Pandits, retained the right to bear arms. That is the first step of a genocide. That is the first step of colonialism. If you colonize a people, you take their right to bear arms away from them.
Absolutely. Huma, if I am to put all this together from the discussion that we had before the question, so it actually flags two things in my mind. The term of rex lex, that king is the law, that used to prevail in earlier times. And then the other term, which is in tension with it, is the term of social contract, which the world apparently, and all the states apparently say that they believe in it, where it is the people who give power to maybe the king or the representative or the head of the state. And that makes me further question and a British installed ruler who the people had been revolting against for 20, 30 odd years by any conservative estimate, what kind of right would he on any moral, legal, or any ground have to take a decision, and how valid that would be? So I find it to be in tension with this social contract. But then, yeah, we have definitely our different ways and perspectives of looking at different things, and we respect these disagreements, and that's what makes academics so enriching and invigorating. So here I want to switch a little from this academic accounts and critical engagement on a very lighter note, so that we cool and calm down a bit, put ourselves a little bit together. I want to come to Wahid. Wahid, if I come to your writings, they are more engaged with the contemporary, especially the era of the armed militancy. So if I again look at the past, it's always said that we are all products of our past, and that has reflected today the way we are talking about things. We are products of our past. How much do you think your work is actually influenced or informed by that understanding of the past?
I mean, everything is informed by the past in direct, indirect, subtle, underground ways. It's a terrible habit for novelists to kind of begin to describe their own work, and I never do it. In my first novel, is the germ of the novel, the germ of the premise is in 47, is in pre-47 Kashmir. What happened? Why is it located on the de facto border between India? Between Indian occupied Kashmir and Pakistani administered Kashmir? Why is it set amongst the people who were in Jammu, who used to inhabit the grazing lands of Jammu? and and then they migrate to Kashmir because they're fleeing violence. They fled violence of 47 to settle in the mountains of Kashmir. They have moved from being nomadic, pastoral. They moved from a pastoral life to sedentary life. They settled a village in Kashmir so that they could live peacefully and have something of their own. This, I keep going back to when land is a symbol. It represents everything. When this act is sort of, when India decides, also with regard to legality and legitimacy that Irfat mentioned earlier, even on the face of it, it's illegal. Why? It happens without consent. Nobody's asking Kashmiris about any of these horrible, punitive laws. It's even within the narrow framework of how laws are made and not made, how they're passed in these constantly changing times, it's not legal because no one has been asked. Anyway, so going back to the novel, so the germ of the novel is in 47. These people have fled enormous brutal violence, from Jammu, and settled in Kashmir to kind of have a new, slightly more peaceful, prosperous life where they grow. They have a farm. They live off the land. They live off the mountains. They live off the valleys. They live off the river. And then that is destroyed when a massive military machine arrives there. And that massive military machine is an occupational machine. I want to keep going back to this because I don't think there's enough work, it is being done. There's some brilliant young Kashmir writers and academics like yours, Ifat, and you, and many others. They're working on it. What the current moment is both the same as 47, but also different. This is now an ideology-driven occupation. This is the RSS version of the Indian occupation of Kashmir. That is why every day they're coming for our land. They're coming for resources. They want to impoverish Kashmiris to the point of destitution so that they have nothing left but to succumb and to bow, so that the Indian state then can say, you are subject to our will. When you have crushed the back of the Kashmiri peasant, the Kashmiri farmer, the Kashmiri orchardist, the Kashmiri artisan, the Kashmiri student, the Kashmiri businessman, the Kashmiri executive, the Kashmiri journalist, you name it. They've gone after every aspect. And I don't think there's enough of reckoning within Kashmir with that aspect. They are coming after everything. They crushed media prior to last year's illegal annexation. They crushed the media because they've known for 30 years the Kashmiri media has become a vibrant entity. They can speak for themselves. They do not need a journalist from India or an Indian media organization to speak their truths and speak their stories. They knew that. That's why they went after the press. That is why you have Kashmiri newspapers now, a large majority of them, who are not even reporting, properly what's happening on the ground because they're terrified. They have been scared. They have been harassed. They have been pressurized. They have been implicated in cases. They are threatened with total destruction. Do you see? This is also part of what has happened. What India is doing to itself. There was an image recently. I've been off social media for various reasons. There was an image that was sent to me recently. It was one of the oldest newspapers, English newspapers, called Kashmir Times. And I have a personal sort of, association with it because when I first started reading newspapers, it was the only properly done English daily from Kashmir because it predates Greater Kashmir. And that was encouraged in the family that, it's a nice professionally done newspaper. And I remember it. And and Mr. Wade Bhasin was the founder editor of this magazine, of this newspaper. Recently, someone said, I got this photo and there was people, Kashmiri officials or Indian officials in Kashmir, putting locks to the offices in Srinagar of this paper. Now, this is the world's largest democracy, allegedly, apparently. There's very little democracy left in India itself. We can't even begin to mention what is done to Kashmir. So, but they don't care anymore. This image is gone everywhere. That here is the government of India shutting down an old newspaper in broad daylight in front of cameras. They don't care. That's what-
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I do believe that there is this ideological war going on in Kashmir, and that brings me to this idea about the power of the narratives, right? They are trying to crush the alternate kind of narratives. Um, uh, Christopher, I am personally interested in talking about how this dominant trope of tribal invasion within the internationalist narratives have therefore sort of induced a sort of national amnesia in terms of what is happening in other parts of Jammu and Kashmir state. So I was basically personally myself shocked to hear from one of the respondents when I was writing my piece on Jammu massacre, when I asked the Jammu Muslim, when we talk about 1947, the dominant trope is the tribal invasion. Why don't we hear about what happened to Jammu Muslims? And his response basically shocked me, and he said, the power of the narratives lied with those people who directly or indirectly were perpetrators of the same violence. So I want you to take us through those alternate kind of experiences and memories of 1947 beyond the nationalist tropes of tribal invasion.
Oh, thank you, Ifat. Look, that's an interesting question. One of the reasons, though, why the Jammu Muslims case has not been terribly well reported is that the communications in Jammu itself were not as good as they were in the valley. The valley's small and compact. Srinagar was about 200,000 people. Jammu city was about 30 or 40,000. The focus was on Srinagar in 1947 because the Maharaja was still there, and even when the Pakhtuns invaded. And Kashmir, that state, Jammu and Kashmir, was always called Kashmir, never Jammu, even though the rulers were from Jammu, even though Jammu province was larger and more populous in 1947 than Kashmir province. The focus has always been on Kashmir because it's been this paradise, this wonderful place that people have wanted to come to, and tourism was very important even in 1947. There'd been 20,000, I think, Britishers had gone there in 1945 as tourists and so on and so forth. So part of the problem with Jammu was that it was always much lower profile than Kashmir. Now, within Jammu itself, you had 7 districts, one of which was the Poonch Jagir. Now, arguably, the Maharaja of Jammu and Kashmir, if it had have been based on the will of the Maharaja, Pratap Singh wanted the Raja of Poonch to be his heir, both spiritual and legal, but the British wouldn't allow it. They'd allow him to be the spiritual heir, but not the legal heir, which is part of the reason why Maharaja Hari Singh in 1935 totally downsized, downgraded the Poonch Jagir and really made that Raja come under his control. So there's that aspect. Within Jammu itself, the eastern parts were more Hindu dominated by population. On the other side of the Chenab, they were more Muslim majority populations. There's geography as well. Those places in Jammu were much closer to Punjab. Jammu was up the road up the railway line from Sialkot. Mirpur was much closer to Jhelum and places like that. Muzaffarabad itself, which was part of Kashmir province, was much closer to Murray in some ways than it was to Srinagar. So it depended on where you were. The valley was its own entity to a large extent, whereas the others were either part of Punjab or incredibly remote. One of the areas that's never really talked about is the Frontier Districts province, which was strongly, 88%, I think, Muslim majority, but very lightly populated and scattered throughout that large area. And if you talk about the Ladakhis, they've been totally forgotten about. The Buddhist Ladakhis were very keen on joining India. The Kargili Ladakhis, who are Shia, we don't know what they wanted to the same extent because that hasn't been reported. But it depended on where you were in the regime. Now, within the valley itself, not everybody was a Kashmiri either. There were other people who weren't Kashmiris, Gujars and Bakarwals mainly, and a few other interlopers. In fact, according to the 1941 census, there were even 2 atheists in the Kashmir Valley. Funnily enough, both of them were women. That's very unusual to be an atheist or to be able, and the census people did not know what to do with these 2 atheists, because clearly everybody in India had a religion. So there are various types of population. But, you know, talking about the language issue too, we talk about Kashmiri, but the Kashmiri dialect in the north was slightly different to the Kashmiri dialogue in the south, dialect in the south, and Srinagar itself was slightly different. So there was more than one way of speaking. And was Kashmiri the language that people wanted to learn? Many people started to learn Urdu because it was more useful when you went to other parts of British India and so on and so forth. Which I just wanted to say something about consent too. And the consent issue is really very interesting because some of the Jammuites, certainly after the 27th of October, started to really be disenchanted with being dominated numerically and politically by Kashmiris, because the division of Kashmir province into Azad Kashmir and the Indian controlled parts weakened Jammu and lessened their political and numerical clout. If it had been unified, they would have had more seats in the Legislative Assembly than the Kashmir Valley, because there were more of them. So they also suffered a loss of consent as well. And the issue, I think, also in terms of consent is that it's clearly Kashmiris don't like what's going on, and it's terrible what's happening there. But the Indian government believes it's got the consent of the population. 47% of whatever it was voted for them at the last election. So consent can go down to the individual level or up to the state level, and there are various levels in between. Consent is a really difficult issue.
Christopher, they put the entire population in prison in order to force the decision last year. So and this is not about what you said. So it is absurd to even begin to ask whether there was any degree of consent. If they were so sure of or convinced of the participation of the Kashmiri people in their own erasure, they would not. Do you know? Of course, you know this. They blocked landlines. They put entire localities under siege. Kashmir is unrecognizable from even what it was 2 years ago. So the idea, they know exactly what they were doing. They know there's going to be massive.
Can I ask what is the
outrage.
meaning of consent under the barrel of a gun?
So there was the question of consent doesn't even arise, because they are putting everyone in prison, from little babies to
90-year-old school teachers.
Everyone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
No,
including our families. Our families were imprisoned in our homes for months.
I totally agree with you,
So
Mirza.
I'm going to say, I wasn't talking about with regard. I was talking the very concept of consent is rendered absurd.
I know, but the challenge for you Kashmiris is, I know you are totally discontented and you do not agree with what's happened, but there are a lot of Indians who agree, and clearly internationally, there's either a lot of states that agree or are prepared to acquiesce in what India is doing. And therein lies the challenge as well, that yes, Kashmiris are clearly upset and agitated and don't agree with what's happening. And I agree with what they're doing. But there are other people within this Indian Union and within the world, the greater world, who do consent. And there
are differences within in terms of how the international community or the so-called right-thinking people see what's been done to Kashmir. And I completely agree. There was widespread support within India for the BJP's ideological project in Kashmir. I'll just spend 1 minute on that. What did they do? You see, it's tied very closely that the figure of the Kashmiri Muslim is an ideal other, for the regime. Yeah. Also, a very readily available punching bag. Because when countries are led by demagogues, they promised the moon and the earth and the heavens to their populations. Similarly, the BJP government has promised everything from cash in bank accounts to a new glorious dawn in India. Now, clearly, those dreams will never be fulfilled. As we already see, it is not being able to. Mr. Modi hasn't delivered on any of those promises he's made. So when you have a large angry population, then what do you do then? You give them this sense of superiority over that demonized other on the margins, which is the Kashmiri Muslim, fits that bill perfectly. And that's a project that's been underway for a long, long time with the Indian media, which is inseparable from the regime, a large parts of it. There are small islands here and there, but mostly Indian media has collapsed. The press has collapsed. It is now merged with the state. They carry the water for the state every day. So they have done it methodically, systematically over the last few years, where they have turned Kashmiris into this hated, demonized figure, which fits perfectly well with the project. So here are these people, ungrateful Kashmiri Muslims. Now, you can go and buy land there. It doesn't matter, the person you're speaking to has nothing with which to buy Kashmiri land. But they have given these people a sense of supremacy over Kashmiri because they're Muslim.
Can I say something here, Wahid? I think just, for example, the example of the United States, just because there's white supremacy here, does not make it ethical, moral, and indeed legal by the construct of international law. So indeed with India, just because it's 1.3 billion people, if every person to that last bit were unethical, that would still not make the situation, the colonization of Kashmir, ethical or moral or legal, indeed, because it's a Brahminical colonialism that we are suffering from. And the whole foundation of international law is based on the right to self-determination. We have been denied the right to self-determination as resolved by United Nations. It's just not Homa and Wahid and Tausif and Ifat saying it. This has been resolved in the largest body that we have for the international community, which is the United Nations. They have agreed that we have the right to determine our future, and that is being denied to us. And according to the very foundation of international law, it's built on our responsibility and our right to resist occupation by all means possible. And when I say
thanks a lot.
Militarism.
Yeah. So actually, we talked about the complexities that are coming up and different ways we are trying to approach the thing. And about this consent, it's also very subjective and very intriguing as well. For example, like internally, maybe the people, whatever they feel, just because they are less in number than how the people outside of it feel about, it shouldn't in some way give a parallel way of getting these things done. This reminds me of something when I was doing my ethnographic fieldwork in downtown. I was talking to an ex-militant who had been bedridden for the last 10 years because he was tortured. And then he was very passionate about this Azadi and that sentiment I could still feel, though he was indisposed, bedridden. And I told him, why do you think about these things? About 100,000 is apparently dead, and now India is a very strong army. You can't fight it. And he was like, give me only one answer. Are we on the right path? Are we there for justice? And I had no answers. He was like, that's the point. It doesn't matter whether we get or not. But then the thing is that we are on the right path. We aren't with the wrong. So that's what actually, keeps it going, keeps this flame running and running and running and shining its light or creating its influence.
Unless correct me if I'm wrong. I think Christopher also meant that he was pointing to unless I've got it wrong, you pointed to the intensity of the challenge with regard to the wide agreement within India with regard to what is being done to Kashmir, and I think that was a point to tell the enormity of the challenge, the intensity of the hostility as well. It's complete, the hostility from the large sections of Indian society, which is the most worrying aspect, because then the state derives a certain legitimacy within their own people when they have widespread support. And that's been manufactured with the help of a very, very happily compliant media,
Indeed.
where it's not, it's actually sometimes it's incorrect to use the word press with large sections of the Indian media, because they've now, they just do exactly what the state tells them to do.
Absolutely. And indeed, when we talk about Christopher, actually, this outsider perspective brings in so much of wealth, like how things are being envisioned. Because like for us being insiders and emotionally involved, things might appear one way. But then this adds another perspective of what is happening to us and why is there at large a condonement of how things are happening or the kind of silences that we are seeing. Maybe this tells us something about the international politics and how this lobbying and other things work. So I was talking about this ex-militant, and it reminds me of the era of militancy. I would like to reframe the question that I earlier posed to Christopher, to Huma now. We've seen that during 1947, there was a celebratory color or mode to this event of 27th of October 1947, but definitely the National Conference and its followers observing or celebrating this event as a dawn of freedom from the Dogra autocratic rule. Then over the time, we see this transition rather snowball into this Black Day, where overwhelmingly in Kashmir, you see, at least in the recent past, that this day was observed as a Black Day. I want to know from you, is it because of the emergence of armed militant resistance in Kashmir from 1989 that led to this switch? How do you explain this change in color? Was it abrupt, or was there already something?
I don't think it was just with the start of militancy or the armed guerrilla movement that October 27 got to be marked as a Black Day. I think from back then, as we've talked about, people, although they loved Sheikh Abdullah, they did not like Indian troops landing in Srinagar. They did not like Indian troops in the bazaars. They did not like to see Indian presence within Jammu and Kashmir. And I think although Sheikh Abdullah was kind of luring people by saying, this is temporary, we'll get our rights, we'll do this, we'll do that, this is temporary, we'll have plebiscites. And then he was arrested. So back in August 1953, he was arrested. You think people continue to celebrate 27th October as the day of liberation for Kashmir? How would that, even those who loved Sheikh Abdullah, they couldn't afford to see India as the colonizers that they are. Way back, I think it's just, it's levels of veils that the colonialism, and in that sense, I think Indian colonialism has been an expert at veiling itself. So something about Israeli occupation that strikes me is that it's very honest. It's genocidal and it's very explicit about its intent. The Indian occupation is equally, if not more, genocidal, but it hides its intent with Bagal mein chhuri muh mein ram ram. So it says one thing and it does another. It's killing us while it's arresting our leaders, while it's pretending to not be a colonialism. So I think that intention was very clear. But as we have seen even with last year, 5th August 2019, that last segment of people who still were sitting on the fence saying, well, at least India is a much more wealthier nation. It's a much larger nation. It's allegedly secular. We might as well stay with India and we'll do better. There was a tiny percentage of those collaborators. We all know them. I think there's no space on the ground left for them. Where do they go now? Can they walk the streets? When I've just visited Kashmir for 3 weeks, and I had the fortune or misfortune to visit 2 of these collaborator people, distantly related to families and so on. And I had to go through various 6 or 7 levels of armed guards before I got to those houses. That's how freely they live in Kashmir. That's the kind of popularity that they enjoy in Kashmir. They cannot walk on regular streets. They have to be behind, they have to have the detailed security, the Z detail, or whatever levels they have over there. They can't, they know that the Kashmiris hate them. So I think this has been a gradual process, and it's at this point, all the blinders are lifted. And I would really again bring attention to this date. 27th October 47 and 27th October 2020. This is a full-fledged settler colonial state. If it wasn't clear before, it should be clear now. And we are under genocide. The United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People is with us. It tells us that no one has the right to change our demography. It stands by us when it protects our culture. Our culture is in need of protection. Our religious traditions are in need of protection. We know what Indian regime does to mosque. We know what it did with Babri Masjid, right? We know what it does with Indian Muslims. Indian Muslims themselves are under an incremental genocide, and that's their problem. They'll have to deal with it in different ways. We are different. We have our land. We are the indigenous people of Jammu and Kashmir. We have a right to safeguard our land, our country, our state, our people, our culture, religious traditions, our diversities, our languages, our way of being. We don't speak the same languages in India, and it's universally acknowledged. It has to be looked. It has to be reframed. It has to be shifted from this stupid land dispute between India and Pakistan. It is not a land dispute between India and Pakistan. It's the right of Kashmiri people to decide their future. We cannot look at it through those narrow lens which suits only India or Pakistan. It doesn't suit the Kashmiris. And that is the ethical way to be. And what it did, if those of us who are paying attention in the longue durée, what India did on August 5th this year was it marked it, the day that it abrogated Article 370 and Article 35A, it marked it by laying the foundation of Ram Temple. Now, what is the connection there? The connection is the victory of Hindutva. The connection is the victory of the mandate that they had offered. They had promised, it was on their mandate from the day zero, the abrogation of Article 370 and the laying of foundation of a Ram Mandir at the very site of Babri Masjid. They did that. If you look back at the stories like Ramayana and Mahabharata and the Vedas, where the indigenous people were called Rakshas or Asuras, this is another 3,000 years later. This is how we will be written into histories. There were these demons, Asuras, these Muslims in Kashmir, and we conquered them, and we, lay the foundation of our culture back in Ayodhya. Please mark my words. This is not a coincidence. And today, again, they've done the same thing. On the day that they occupied Kashmir, they have formally declared it to be a settler colony for any and every Indian to come take a piece of Kashmir.
Thank you, Huma. So I'm basically reminded of this when Sheikh Abdullah actually loses plot in 1953. There is this role reversal, even in the internationalist narratives, that he is celebrated as this secular figure, and then he all of a sudden becomes this religious fanatic who is sort of like, conspiring against the Indian nation and threatening that integrity of the Indian Union. To go back to history, Wahid, because I'm a history student, I can't really break free from that. I came across this reference to Philip Neal Baker. He is a British delegate to Security Council in 1948. He noted that it would be at the crossroads of Kashmir where history would be made. But as a pessimist Kashmiri, I don't see that happening in any time in the near future. So I'm really keen to understand this invisibility of Kashmiris in the discourse of defining their own futures, which I believe Pankaj Mishra also talks in his conversation with you about, how inevitably Kashmiris sink in this oblivion in defining their own discourses. So I want to know from you, what role can people who have international audiences like you play in making Kashmiris visible in these discourses?
I'll probably I think we can translate for Christopher. Okay. Tикәзі тәмсітмелі кәсике. Çapı kırı tipi yok ne mari? İmo çapı kır. Timon kaf. Timon titramaz. Çapı çene katan. Çapı silence is not an option. It never was. Okay. And that sort of applies to everyone. You know, when I say everyone, I don't mean it has to be the preserve of the narrative makers, so to speak, the writers and the journalists and the poets and the dramatists or the historians or the people who do make narratives, who write stories. Everyone has to sort of speak in their own way. There has obviously been attempts to suppress Kashmiri voices forever. You know, as I said earlier, you know, it was not it was not a coincidence that they came for the press, you know, because they had sort of studied this, that, in the last 35 years, Kashmiri press is not what it used to be. It's become a very vibrant, independent. Yes, there are sort of, you know, odd people here and there or odd spaces here and there, but largely speaking, it became very, very vibrant, and they came to crush it. And now there is, you know, a generation of Kashmiris who know how to speak, who know how to tell their story, you know, and no amount of arm twisting, no amount of distortion, no amount of obfuscation from the TV channels, I say this, from Delhi will change that. You know, they run these propagandist sort of programs, or outright sort of, you know, I call it hate TV. It's hate TV. They promote hate. They showcase hate. You know, and the primary targets of those hate broadcasts are Kashmiris, Indian Muslims, Dalits, women who speak their mind, you know, and many other disenfranchised, marginalized. I mean, I don't like the word marginalized because it assumes there is a sort of, you know, ethical center somewhere. So Kashmiris have been speaking in the ways they can. There are younger Kashmiris who are very, very articulate and have the tools, like yourself, and, you know, and in Kashmir. But I wanted to say one thing: the primacy of the what is of the people in Kashmir. By which I'm not saying that the diaspora, or I mean, I don't consider myself diasporic. Does not. It is their responsibility. If they have a platform, they should speak. Use that platform to speak for Kashmiris and speak about the truth of Kashmiris. Have an honest reckoning with it. But the primacy belongs to the Kashmiri people in the place, who continue to live under their daily lives under this, you know, horrific and horrifying occupation, where every aspect, from morning, from the walk, you know, you of course know Kashmiri women, the walk outside the house is a fraught enterprise. It's not normal. You know, from those even ordinary things like walking outside your house, it is, you are met with this uh, predatory gaze by the soldier stationed outside your house. That is now gone on for a long, long time, since 47, more so since late 80s. So I'm just one example. So those are the people whose voices we have to listen to. If we find that they are being suppressed, they're not being allowed to speak, then people, you know, like yourself, have to find ways of giving voice to those people who have basically been gagged, or they have been threatened with you know, danger should they choose to speak. Some people do, but I will not complain if somebody decides to stay silent because they've been threatened with, you know, with grave consequences, not just economic consequences, but consequences of physical danger. You know, so then it falls on, you know, people who have a voice, in whatever way it does, you know, that they must make the world listen to what is being done. As Huma Adia mentioned, this is a daily occupation. This is a daily denial of basic dignity to life. You know, when people can't, you know, travel safely, when people can't assemble, you know, when people can't talk. And last year, we all remember, it was unprecedented anywhere in the world, that you could not speak to your dear ones for months. Why? Because Indian state decides that you cannot speak. So in that context, it's important, and that everyone, whether it's through books or novels or important sort of academic work, which a lot of Kashmiri academics are now engaged in. And I also wanted to mention that traditionally speaking, the women's voices, and I say this not from the narrow prism of gender balance, but then that's how it ought to be. We don't have to balance one male voice with one female voice. No, it is a given that there should be.
Okay. So the kind of picture that you are portraying.
Why I mentioned women, because traditionally it is getting better. It is getting better. Everything is not a sort of broad brush. It's getting better, but if we have to be honest,
a lot of ground to be covered.
We have to be honest and admit there hasn't been enough space and available to Kashmiri women's voices. And each one of us, one learns, unlearns, relearns, and it is a fault line within Kashmiri society as well.
Quite right.
And it's getting better, but it remains so that there are strong patriarchal practices that still prevail, but the younger Kashmiri men and women are breaking some of those shackles, but more needs to be done.
Absolutely.
I think us men, we need to shut up sometimes, and because as a friend once said, that you give a man a microphone, then that's what they think, and then I have to hold forth and speak to the world. So I think I think some of us should shut up and listen more to Kashmiri women.
Thank you so very much, Wahid. Indeed, I'm reminded of our program a few weeks back, and it was about women and how patriarchy is actually, in a way, disempowering them. So definitely, a lot needs to be done, but I realize that there is an awakening and there is an acceptance of this reality, and also the kind of picture that you portrayed. It got something, a theoretical concept into my mind, and that's post-colonial hegemony, and how it actually it's reflected, it intervenes, and it gets itself into the minutest aspects of the everyday lives of the subordinate people. And it downgrades and emaciates their resisting power. So there is no room left where then they find some mundane ways, and the people outside who have a way of raising their voices, dissenting, or giving resistance in some way or the other is the only options left. Because when you talk of post-colonial hegemonies, from that theoretical concept, the space for resistance is really choked. So yeah, here I because I realize that we've already passed 2 hours and we have to wind it up. So I pose my last question, and we take this as the last round, where we'll try to be kind of brief in our answers. If we talked about invisibility, I had 2 things coming in my mind: invisibility and visibility, and on 2 different paradigms. So if I'm coming to Christopher, my reading of your work is that when you, in your work at many places, talk about the genesis of Kashmir conflict, the work reads to me that Jammu was the epicenter of Kashmir conflict, whereas when I see Muzaffarabad, which was administratively under Kashmir, that was the nerve center. So how would you explain this? Is this a tension or a transition from Jammu to Kashmir, number one? Number second is slightly different. There is an overemphasis, rather a fetish of one quote that is always ascribed to the Indian leader Gandhi, that during the partition era, when the entire subcontinent was burning, the only ray of hope he saw was in Jammu and Kashmir, or Kashmir. Then, where do these massacres, these killings and atrocities go? And how much does this dismantle? Almost every politician in India and in Kashmir, they repeat this. There is a fetish of repetition of this thing. How valid do you think that claim remains?
Well, dealing with Gandhi first, he actually said that he was really perturbed about the massacres in Jammu. And I think when he was talking about communal harmony in Kashmir, he meant the valley. Because one of the things about you Muslims in the Kashmir Valley is that you are different from other Muslims in the subcontinent, certainly in India anyway, what we now call India, that you didn't feel threatened by being a minority because you weren't a minority within the valley. It was the Hindus and the Sikhs who were the minority communities. You were almost 94% of that population. So you had a different way of dealing with minorities, and there was communal harmony because you didn't need to defend yourselves as against other Muslims in India who were clearly a minority amongst the large Hindu population, and of course still are. But Ian Stevens, the former editor of The Statesman, spoke to Gandhi just before Gandhi was assassinated. And Gandhi was apparently depressed, according to Stevens. And Stevens said he was depressed because of hearing about the terrible killings, particularly of Muslims, that went on in Jammu. So Gandhi knew about these. I've got a friend who lives the other side of Melbourne who's a Gandhi scholar, who says you have to be very careful about things that are attributed to Gandhi. Some of these things aren't actually attributed to him. He didn't say them. They've become popular myths. So that's a second aspect. But there was communal harmony in the Kashmir Valley, no doubt, and total communal disharmony in Jammu. In relation to Muzaffarabad district was one of the 3 districts of Kashmir province, but it only became significant in terms of the India-Pakistan dispute when the Pakhtuns arrived on the 22nd of October. Before that, there wasn't any agitations there either for, there may have been people saying we want to join Pakistan or we want Jammu and Kashmir to join India, but there wasn't any violence or any communal disharmony the way there was in the Poonch Jagir and Mirpur, where this Poonch uprising had started. And that started perhaps as early as around the partition time. There were people there saying, including Sardar Qayyum and others, saying, we want Jammu and Kashmir to join Pakistan, after they'd been disarmed by the Maharaja's police, who then redistributed those arms to Sikhs and Muslims. They went up to the arms bazaars of the northwest frontier and bought arms and came back. Some of them also moved their women and children away from those areas and started to fight the Maharaja's forces. And so there was that violence. By the time the Pakhtuns arrived, people like Sardar Ibrahim had taken over and become much more organised. And Sardar Ibrahim apparently was in Muzaffarabad when the Pakhtuns arrived. But before that, Muzaffarabad wasn't important. It became important because it is its position on the Jhelum Valley Road, through which the Pakhtuns came, supposedly to get to Srinagar, to both capture Srinagar and the Maharaja and get his accession. Now, in terms of the violence in Jammu, one of the arguments is that the Pakhtuns came in to protect Muslims, and geographically, it would have been easier for the Pakhtuns to arrive via Sialkot. They could have come down the Grand Trunk route and then turned left at Sialkot or a bit further up and gone into Jammu and Kashmir that way. And that would have made it almost impossible for India to take that particular part of the world. It would have been very difficult. The Pathankot route would have been cut off, but they came in via the Jhelum Valley, partly because they'd been told that Kashmiris were wealthy and that there was money to be made. And we know that they did terrible things to all communities, including Muslims. And that's when Muzaffarabad became important as that gateway to allow their transition into and out of the valley. Tulsi.
Thank you, Christopher. I mean, the only takeaway from our conversation tonight is how events shape our politics, our psyches and behaviors, right? So Homa, in what ways do you think that this event has informed your own political and social becoming? I mean, this is a very personal kind of tangent.
Well, I grew up dislocated. I grew up on our lunch table, dinner table. The conversation was always about Kashmir. It was always about Srinagar. It was always about my parents' childhood memories. It was we didn't have a hometown, a home village in Pakistan where I was born. So I was always born dislocated. And again, I talked about the issue of language. My parents spoke to us in Urdu, but my father's mother tongue was Kashmiri, and my mother would have spoken Punjabi at home because she was born in Amritsar, the family of Saifuddin Kichru. And so they spoke in another language that was their learned language to their kids. So there's always this colonial appropriation of tongues in our, but the identity, we were always Kashmiris throughout in Pakistan. I moved every second year, we would move and we were always Kashmiris. And, but when I meet Kashmiris online and people ask about our histories and, or sometimes they assume that I speak Kashmiri, or they assume that I grew up in the valley, and I have to tell them the long history. And I always actually had to take a distance. I did not go through that experience of sending my children to school with an address in their pocket to ward off, if God forbid something happens to them on the way back home, somebody would know where to bring them the bodies back, right? I do not have that experience. I do not have the experience of Kunan Poshpora, and I do not have the experience of being under the Indian jackboot in Indian occupied Kashmir. And for the longest time, I would actually, you know, very hesitantly declare myself as a Kashmiri. And it's only, but I thought it was time that our historical experience, which actually is critical to justice in Jammu and Kashmir. It is very critical to the, inshallah, the freedom, azadi, our final justice in Jammu and Kashmir, for our experience to be recounted. And going back to Professor Snedden's comments about Gandhi, I think Gandhi did say the ray of light was the comment on Kashmiri people in the valley, that we as a people did not react to the massive genocide happening in Jammu. And it was also, we were not receiving information. I think Kashmiris in the valley were not receiving information about what was happening in Jammu. And Sheikh Abdullah, when he got to know, he turned his face the other way and he said, well, they were not going to vote for me in any case. That is also on record. It is also on record that Gandhi celebrated the hum of the landing of the Indian Air Force planes in Srinagar airport on today, 27th October, 1947. He celebrated the hum of the airplane, so an occupation. Having said that, you know, it's his politics around gender, we all know. His politics around caste, we all know. His first fast to freedom was precisely to deny Dalits, under Dr. Ambedkar, their right, their just ethical right to proportionate representation, separate electorate.
Thanks a lot, Huma. I think that's another topic. For now, I think Annihilation of the Caste by Ambedkar is a wonderful book that might shed some light on this. There is an argument or a dialogue between Gandhi and Ambedkar. That would be interesting. Thank you so very much for sharing your experiences, your personal and intimate experiences with us. And we are really sorry for what your family has gone through. I realize we've actually run out of time. Last, I want to go to Waheed. Waheed, my question is that at last, is there something that you would like to tell to your and our Kashmiris? Even if you want to say that in Kashmiri, that would be perfectly all right. And also a little bit of light question. In future, do we anticipate you writing something of fiction or non-fiction around this era?
So that was 3 questions, right?
Okay.
So yes, you know, a writer, this is what we do. I would want to write about everything. I might want to write a story set in the era of Badshah. You know, why stop at 47? Or some, you know, there are plenty of Kashmiri writers, some very, very brilliant writers, much more capable and skilled than I am, who could do wonderful stuff with, you know, wonderful work with 47, pre-47, you know, and they should, and they could do everything. What was the other thing you asked?
So the other thing was a message that you'd like to give to your Kashmiris, even if that's in Kashmiri.
It would be a message from let's say, as Mr. Pamuk once said, you know, from a naive and sentimental novelist, I think plant trees at every little bit of land you see, plant, grow more trees, make it difficult for the settlers, at least, it won't stop them, but make it difficult. Let them be seen cutting those trees off when they come for those patches. Put them everywhere. It is probably a very rather naive suggestion, but yeah, if I have a bit of ground outside my house, I should plant trees on it, as many as I can. The other thing, because you see, with regard to Kashmir, with the specific, and which we heard some very important and instructive bits from Christopher and Huma and yourselves, the land, culture, history, economic well-being, all those are, as we all know, very closely linked. Land, especially, within Kashmir, it has a very intimate connection, with the Kashmiri national consciousness. And that's what they're coming for, and that's what they want to destroy. And when I say land, I mean it in the broadest terms. It means your shrine, it means your commons, it means the bit of land running parallel to the Lidr, it means your banks on the lakes and the shores. It means the little streams running parallel to the highways where the enemy runs its trucks, the armed soldiers go in droves and trucks. So those are part of Kashmiri consciousness. That's what I mean by land. I don't just mean the patch I bought with ill-gotten money behind my house. I mean the land, the bit of land under the Chinar where you go and rest in the summers. Those are part of your those are part of really close, intimate, integral parts of Kashmiri consciousness. And this regime, this vicious regime, they know it, and they want to destroy it, so that there's nothing left for you to fight for. And we have to try every single way to kind of protect it, to preserve this.
Can I ask a quick question? Do you feel then that a lot of Kashmiris are going to be enticed to sell their land to non-Kashmiris, Mirza?
It has. I would be dishonest if I said it hasn't happened in the past. Our political classes are quite venal, some of them. So in the past, when it was illegal to sell land, they would lease things. Let's say, 99 year lease to so and so corporate group for this amazing property by the lake. When I say property, it means orchards and terraces and gardens and a colonial era building, which was a hotel. So that's what they used to do. And you see a debilitating aspect of the Indian plans in Kashmir has been the participation of some of our elites, political elites especially, because they've been very happy to do this job for the Indian state, to protect their own privileges. And privileges come in various forms, not just a nice car, but it also means property and land, and get prime bits of land. And those mean transactions that involve transactions. Transactions means give and take. So short answer is the worry is there might be some people who will be happy to enable this process. I think the question would be better answered by people in Kashmir right now. But my guess would be there'd be some, but not a lot of people, but some people. It also depends on what kind of people we're talking about. People who have no investment, who want their next four-wheel drive, if that is the life, if that they derive meaning from that. So they wouldn't care about selling this patch of land to so and so, because their meaning comes from the next shining SUV. And some of our political classes have been guilty of those short-sighted maneuvers that in order to protect this privilege. So and so it's for houses. Our political classes, they live in palatial houses or used to. Those, most of them are government property, state property. They belong to the state of Jammu and Kashmir, by which I mean to the people of Kashmir. So yeah, some of them, I hope not, of course, I hope not. And a large majority, I think, would resist,
I think some of the first houses or properties to go on sale would be those that are now looted by this current regime from the custodial properties, houses of my grandparents, which were until last year, they were under custodial property acts and no one else owned them, but the government would use the properties while keeping them still under the name of the original owners. I think those might be the first ones. So from the Google images, I see one of the houses of my grandparents as having some construction on it, and it breaks my heart. But I mean, the personal question, actually, I don't get too personal because it really is painful. But I look at Google Earth every now and then to see what is happening to my grandparents' houses. There are two houses on that NIT, the road that goes right in front of the NIT, and the house opposite to it. And I look at that yard, I look at the houses to see what is happening. And there is construction going on in the smaller house.
Thank you so very much. I'm afraid that's all the time that we had today. And on that note, I must say it was incredibly kind of all the panelists to give their time and share their experiences and their ideas on this very timely and important conversation. Our hope and actually aim was to puncture, silence these official and dominant narratives and bring out those narratives where you have multiple and subjective experiences of people burning brightly. And we just leave on hopeful notes. Over to you, Tawseef.
Yeah, absolutely. You don't leave much to me to explain or say. So everything has been said. And as I said in the beginning, that the endeavor was to uncover some silences, some gray areas, and some enigmas. And I think we've succeeded to some extent. So here I look, Waheed is really tired because it's quite late in our part of the world. So we will sign off here with the hope that things will get better, with the hope ki sham hai gham ki magar sham hi to hai. There's always a dawn. There's always the silver lining around the dark cloud. So let's hope for the best, and let's hope that we engage with you again. So Christopher, Huma, Waheed, we're really thankful to you guys. So it's us signing off. Take care of yourselves, and we'll be waiting for your feedback and comments. Bye-bye. Thank you.